By January 1781, the American war effort in the South looked finished. Charleston had fallen the previous spring, costing the Continental Army more than 5,000 prisoners in the single worst defeat of the entire conflict. Lord Cornwallis now held most of the southern colonies, and bands of loyalist militia roamed the countryside, terrorizing families loyal to the rebellion, while patriot resistance seemed to be unraveling town by town. George Washington sent Major General Nathaniel Greene to salvage what remained of the Continental presence in the region. What Greene inherited was barely a fighting force. Roughly 1,400 underfed, poorly supplied soldiers scattered across the Carolina backcountry, with no clear way to challenge Cornwallis's larger, better-equipped army head-on. Most commanders in his position would have pulled everything together into one body and waited for reinforcements. Greene made an unconventional choice. Rather than consolidate his weak army, he split it in two, sending 600 men west under Brigadier General Daniel Morgan. Morgan was nothing like the polished officers commanding most Continental units. Raised in poverty in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley, he had spent his early years hauling freight as a teamster. During the French and Indian War, a British officer had him whipped 500 times for striking a superior, scars he carried for life, and a grudge he reportedly turned into dark humor, joking that the drummer keeping count had shortchanged the British by one stroke. When the Revolution began, Morgan raised a company of Virginia riflemen and fought through some of the war's harshest campaigns, from the failed assault on Quebec, where a musket ball tore through his neck, to the woods around Saratoga, where his marksmen helped break a British army and forced General Burgoyne's surrender. By 1780, he carried both a deep contempt for British regulars and something rarer than any formal training, a clear-eyed understanding of how untested men actually behaved in combat. That understanding came from hard experience on both sides of the coin. At Saratoga, he had watched militia hold their nerve and tear apart advancing redcoats. At Camden, he had watched a different militia force collapse the instant British bayonets came into view, sending more than 2,000 men fleeing in panic. Morgan didn't see cowardice in that collapse. He saw an honest mismatch between expectation and ability. Asking farmers with muskets to stand firm against trained infantry in open ground was asking the impossible. It wasn't about courage. It was about what raw civilians could realistically be expected to do. That single insight, refusing to wish his army into something it wasn't, became the seed of everything that followed. When word reached Morgan that Banastre Tarleton was closing in with more than 1,000 British regulars, dragoons, and loyalist infantry, he had options. He could have retreated toward Greene's main force and avoided a fight altogether, dragging his exhausted men deeper into the backcountry. Instead, he halted at a stretch of open grazing land known locally as the Cowpens. His own officers thought the spot was a mistake. The broad river sat roughly 5 miles behind them, blocking any line of retreat, and the open pasture offered no woods, swamp, or high ground to hide behind, nothing that might shield panicked men from a sweeping cavalry charge. Morgan had chosen the ground deliberately. With a river at their backs, his militia had nowhere to run if panic set in, but he wasn't asking them to fight to the death either. He understood that fear of failure, not lack of courage, was what usually broke Green soldiers, so he built a plan that simply removed the chance to fail. He was asking for something narrow and achievable, and he spent the entire night before the battle making sure every soldier understood exactly what that was. He moved from campfire to campfire, crouching beside shivering militiamen, trading jokes, recounting Saratoga, and laying out each man's job in plain terms. The militia, he promised, would never face a bayonet charge, just fire twice and walk away with their honor intact. The Continentals were told they were the wall nothing would break through. The cavalry, hidden out of sight, were told they would deliver the finishing blow. No one walked away from that night confused about their role, an unusual degree of personal attention for a battlefield commander in that era. By dawn, Morgan had built his army into 3 lines across roughly 1,000 yards of gently rising pasture, each set about 150 yards behind the one in front. The front line held some 150 sharpshooters from Georgia and the Carolinas, frontiersmen capable of hitting a man at well over 200 yards, with simple orders: pick off officers, then fall back. Behind them stood roughly 300 militia under Andrew Pickens, tasked only with firing 2 aimed volleys at close range before withdrawing around the rear of the next line. The third line was the anchor, about 450 Continental regulars and seasoned Virginia militia under Lieutenant Colonel John Eager Howard, trained to stand and trade volleys like professionals. And tucked entirely out of view behind a second rise waited Lieutenant Colonel William Washington, with roughly 80 Continental dragoons and 45 mounted militia, the blow nobody would see coming until it landed. Tarleton, just 26 and notorious for aggression bordering on recklessness, had pushed his exhausted men through a brutal overnight march, rousing them at 2 in the morning to cover nearly 8 miles of frozen, muddy ground before dawn. Starved of sleep and food, his troops were in poor shape, but Tarleton's confidence never wavered. Every previous clash with American militia had ended the same way, and when his scouts reported Morgan's army backed against a river with no escape, he saw an easy kill and attacked at once, without rest, proper reconnaissance, or a meaningful reserve. The British advance first met the line of riflemen, whose long-range fire dropped officers from their saddles before the skirmishers melted back as planned. Next came the militia line, which the British recognized instantly as the kind of ragged civilian force that always broke and ran. At 50 yards, Pickens's men unleashed 2 volleys that tore gaps in the British ranks, then, exactly as rehearsed, turned and filed away around the rear. To Tarleton's soldiers, this looked like total collapse. Officers screamed for pursuit, discipline dissolved into a flat-out chase, and the British surged uphill convinced the fight was already won. What they ran into instead was Howard's fresh Continental line, waiting in perfect order. At nearly point-blank range, Howard's volley shredded the disorganized charge, and his men followed with a bayonet assault that sent the British reeling backward for the first time all morning. At that moment, Washington's cavalry burst from behind the hill and slammed into the exposed British flank. Then Pickens's militia reappeared on the opposite side, reformed and firing. The British found themselves surrounded on 3 sides, a full double envelopment pulled off by farmers and frontiersmen against one of the world's most professional armies. The British line shattered within minutes. Soldiers surrendered in droves. Tarleton himself barely escaped after a brief saber duel with Washington. In under an hour, Morgan's force had killed or wounded over 300 British troops and captured nearly 600 more, against just 12 American dead, a kill ratio so lopsided that historians still treat it with some disbelief. Cornwallis, furious and a quarter of his light troops poorer, burned his own supply wagons chasing Greene north, a pursuit that eventually exhausted his army at Yorktown that October. Military academies still study Cowpens today as a textbook double envelopment, often alongside Hannibal's Cannae, and for good reason. Morgan won not by wishing his militia were something else, but by building an entire trap around exactly what they already were. The defeat helped push Cornwallis toward the fateful pursuit that ended 7 months later at Yorktown, where the British war effort in America finally collapsed for good.